Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vredos. I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and Yeshiva University here in New York City. The family courts were first established in the United States in the early part of the 1900s at the urging of probation officers who believed that they should combine criminal non-support, juvenile delinquency, and divorce in a unified way to encourage rehabilitative treatment for family conflicts. At the same time, the child savers movement emerged and was responsible for starting the juvenile court and juvenile justice system, and even invented the term delinquency. They saw themselves as protecting the country from the so-called dangerous, inferior, and socially disorganized immigrant classes, numbering in the 20-plus millions, who are making their way to America from Eastern and Southern Europe from the 1880s to the 1920s. Largely drawn from the white Protestant upper and middle classes, they believed punitive and intrusive policies and programs were needed to, quote unquote, save the children and adolescents of these working class urban families, and urged the courts to use indiscriminate arrest, indeterminate sentencing, military discipline, and enforced labor as policies to regulate them. What they helped create was a system of structural violence and institutional breakdown. From the beginning, family courts have had a checkered, corrupt past that muddied distinctions between criminal and civil proceedings. We're thrilled to welcome a dear colleague and comrade, Dr. Bandy X Lee, to the Radical Imagination today. She's writing a long overdue expose addressing the hidden abuses and victims of today's family courts, using commentaries by experts and personal firsthand experiences. Bandy recounts a 2-year experience with the system that destroyed her own sister's physical and emotional well-being to the point of endangering her life, documenting a relentless campaign of biased, harmful, and unconstitutional rulings which allowed her sister's children to be illegally abducted and given sole custody to their abusive father under spurious legal decrees and without due process. The case is far from unusual and has become very much the norm across the country. She argues that court actors are cooperating and colluding with each other in backroom deals that have nothing to do with the best interest of children, parenting ability, or fairness. Bandy is a world-renowned forensic psychiatrist and expert on violence, and was the editor of the New York Times bestseller, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. I'm thrilled to be working with her and Dr. James Gilligan to establish the Institute for the Prevention of Violence. In Bandy's expose, entitled The Family Court Genocide, Judge-Driven Racketeering in Money Laundering and Child Trafficking should be a valuable contribution to the field and of interest to anyone dedicated to lowering the toxic and destructive levels of violence and injustice in America. So, Bandy, thank you so very, very much for being here today and to discuss this incredible work that you are involved in, and personal, intellectual. This work has taken you to, in a sense, a new level of scholarship and activism. And so thank you so very, very much for coming on the show and sharing these very difficult questions and situations that you've been involved in. So welcome, Bandy.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. I will just state a disclaimer that the title of Family Court Genocide is not mine, but that of the Foundation for Child Victims of Family Courts.
Okay.
But as you know, I edited The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. Now I will be editing The Dangerous Case of the Family Courts. After 20 years in criminal and civil courts as an expert witness, nothing had prepared me for what I discovered in the family courts. As you illustrated, it was through a family experience. By the way, my sister is doing relatively well, but there are many women who are being, in essence, abused and violated against with no due process, and their children being taken away, mainly because the family courts function under the assumption that child abuse does not exist. And
how did that come to be? That seems rather odd that they won't even entertain that possibility.
Yes.
How did that happen?
I think it has partly to do with the adversarial system that we have and the fact that our court system is largely driven by money, one's ability to afford defense, and especially in civil cases and family dispute cases, those who have the funds and the bias of the court. The court brings with it the greatest bias that children, that parents cannot harm their children. In fact, abuse allegations are disbelieved 95% of the time, even though false allegations are less than 1 in 1,000. There was one study showing 0.01%. So, well, I have many theories about why this is happening. Family courts have been given greater flexibility and discretion with the law, initially with good intentions, but the lack of oversight and the power to conduct all proceedings in secrecy, which only the family courts appear to have, makes them function much like the prison system. Yeah. And likewise, it has led to disastrous results. A world of brutality and violence flourished once in prisons behind concrete walls. Now they are happening in courts of law behind court seals and gag orders. And it's disturbing beyond anything I've witnessed in my forensic practice, especially since innocent children are involved here.
Let me ask you one question. Is it also true that lawyers are very reluctant to put children on the stand to testify? Is that part of it?
That's not really the problem, whether the children testify or not, because the bias is overwhelming that abuse of children is rare, that whenever allegations occur, the protective parent is making it up or coaching them. That is the overwhelming preconception in line with society's prejudices that, well, we'd like to pretend that child abuse is not as prevalent as it is. 1 in 4 children are sexually abused before they reach the age of 18, and 1 in 5 children are physically abused, and all of these children are psychologically abused. Right. Despite the enormous lifelong psychological and physical problems this brings with decades of lost life, we still do not wish to believe that violence against children is a problem. And yet, the majority of children who are murdered by their parents, majority of children who are murdered by their parents. And about 1/5 of those who are murdered by their parents are sent there by the family courts. In fact, there are hundreds of child deaths per year, many hundreds more of suicides, and of course, if we counted injuries, in the thousands.
And you say that half the children, or more than half, are placed in with sole custody with the abusive parent.
Yes.
That's incredible.
Yes. 59% of children end up in the unprotected sole custody of the abusive parent. It's become such a crisis that even the United Nations has declared this a global public health crisis, where calling what the family courts are doing, of course, it started in the United States about 4 decades ago, specifically with an individual named Richard Gardner, who, as a psychiatrist, seemed to have had some issues himself and may have been a sexual predator himself, promoted the hypothesis that child sexual abuse was very rare, and women were interfering with the healthy development of children to be sexually conditioned for the propagation of the species by their adult parents or other adults in their lives. And even though that's not accepted by any reputable medical organization, has never been really accepted by any serious scholarly journals. In fact, all his papers were self-published and were anecdotal. And nevertheless, courts have found this false, unscientific theory to be advantageous for its adversarial antagonism against the other side, and judges not being trained in violence against children and how dangerous it can be, how prevalent it is, end up giving the child over to the abusive parent, and many to their murders, whereas the protective parent is often penalized, taken, not allowed to see their children, and even imprisoned. And when I read about these things, I was shocked. And
Right.
now I realize it's a routine occurrence.
Yeah. Let's get into your own the specific case in just a couple of minutes. I was just curious as to what you thought that I tried to mention in the opening concerning the child savers. And did you see, any connection between the beginnings of the juvenile court, juvenile justice system, the mindset of these child savers who were trying to save these kids in some way from what was perceived to be these immigrant inferior masses of families that were coming over? I mean, do you think that starts at that
Further
point?
back?
I'm sorry.
Whether it starts further back.
Yeah.
I imagine their family courts may have been used abusively in the past,
Right.
but the gross abuses that we see today, to the point where many are claiming that family courts are acting as child trafficking agents, not just, not across borders, of course, and certainly not as groups, but in sending children routinely to their abusers, tormentors, and murderers. And why is this occurring? It's occurring at epidemic levels. One study showed that over 58,000 children a year are being sent, and the numbers are growing rapidly. But before Richard Gardner's doctrine that of using what he termed parental alienation as a key phrase for denying abuse and essentially reversing victim and offender, before that doctrine, family courts apparently functioned more normally, and child abuse allegations were seriously looked into. Nowadays, whenever there's a child abuse allegation, the courts see it as, unfortunately, as a money-making opportunity. When they send the child to the wrong parent, it sets in motion many mechanisms that would involve many court custody evaluators, guardians ad litem, and makes for a prolonged litigation that allows for many court players to earn tremendous amounts of money. And I was shocked to learn that many expert witnesses are in fact favored by the courts for their producing essentially fraudulent reports that simply echo or rubber stamp what the court is trying to do. And that is one way to circumvent the court's responsibility to fact find and follow procedure. But the main problem, I believe, is that family courts are not bound by the law. They're given a lot of discretion, initially with good intentions, but ultimately to allow judges to do whatever they wish. If they wish to do it for financial gain or to be for their political advantage as elected judges, or simply for personal bias, they can simply do so regardless of the facts. And once they form a false opinion, and usually abusers are very charming in court, especially where it's a matter of impression making. There's certainly the skilled at that. Once they form a bias, they don't wish to go back on what they have claimed, and so so it becomes a vicious circle where they will try to find facts or produce reports or manufacture evidence that their initial bias was correct.
And there's no real appeal process?
Not other than the normal process, which takes years. And the average, even for families, even for parents who get their children back, the average length of time is about 3.5 years. And by that time, it's an enormous part of a child's growth process. And by that time, they've been traumatized psychologically, physically, in many ways that they are difficult to recover. It's meaningless to get them back 3.5 years later. And yet, family courts are believing fathers, usually fathers, sometimes it's also mothers, but overwhelmingly fathers' reports of parental alienation 95% of the time. They disbelieve abuse allegations 95% of the time, even though, as I said before, less than 0.01% are false. The child abuse is so underreported, partly because people do not respond. And family courts, rather than fulfilling the responsibility of protecting families and keeping children safe, are ending up doing the opposite. Partly whether it's out of ignorance or increasingly because of corruption and malfeasance, it has become an epidemic in this country and beyond.
Are most family court judges male?
No, but it is a culture where women, in order to get to their positions, had to be more male than males themselves.
More papist than the Pope. Yeah,
yes.
That sort of psychodynamic. So, do you want to tell us a little more specifically about your sister's case to illustrate what you're talking about here?
Yes, I was unfamiliar with the family courts. In fact, now that I have seen what family courts do, the criminal courts and the civil courts I used to criticize seem to be like bastions of rationality and civility in comparison. The family courts are really a dark place where all kinds of violence and harm to children and women especially can happen with impunity. And because of gag orders and court seals, society cannot know about them. Litigants cannot seek alternative help. And litigants do not realize that others are going through the same problem themselves.
Mhm.
So what happened with my sister was she was undergoing a rather, what seemed to be on the surface, a rather normal divorce. Her children were growing up happy and healthy. In fact, they were intellectually and emotionally precocious and prodigies, thriving in school and at the home. They had an absentee father. Other than missing him, he sometimes showed up for 5-minute photo opportunities, we called them, and then he would disappear. But they were overall healthy and developing normally.
Was he very busy in his career, or is that why he didn't? He wasn't at home very much, traveling, or what was?
He is a lawyer, in
Lawyer.
fact, a student of Alan Dershowitz.
Wow.
And many have said that family courts are used to retaliate against whistleblowers, even if it's unrelated to family court. Perhaps knowing that I do not have children myself, getting at my niece and nephew, who I love like my own children, was a way to try to silence me. But anyhow, there's no way to prove that, of course.
Right. But he wasn't. Did you say he was an absentee father? How old were How old are the children?
The children were 7 and 9 when he started to get involved. And the moment he got involved with the children, there were screams and cries just reverberating through the house. There was not even a honeymoon period of their father suddenly being interested in them. Previously, he was too busy with extramarital affairs. He sometimes brought the women to the house, even as he ignored the children. He attended wine tasting dinners, led essentially a bachelor's lifestyle. Also is addicted to pornography. And what had happened was, as the children were increasingly becoming distressed from having to spend time with their father, he was paying more and more attention to them. They started having violent fights for the first time in their lives, injuring themselves, and they even tried to set the house on fire because going to their father was torture, in their words, torture and worse than death. They used to.
Why did he suddenly change so dramatically and become interested in the children? Does this get back at his wife in some way, or what?
Yes, family courts are often used as vehicles or weapons of abuse if the wife is either trying to leave. We know that 75% of women who are murdered by their partners are murdered as they are leaving. And in this case, the mother wasn't trying to leave. The father, apparently because he had a mistress at the time, and because his wife was, in a sense, too emotionally healthy to succumb to a kind of Stockholm syndrome or a battered woman syndrome, that she started standing up to him. So it's essentially strong women who are most often destroyed by family courts, from accounts of those who are veterans in this field. And
did he have a separate household? I mean,
yes, there was. After he once almost killed his infant daughter, threw her in the air, and she landed headfirst on a concrete floor. And then a second time, he dangerously injured his son, slamming him between a chair and a wall-length door. And that was when a temporary restraining order was placed against him. So he was required to leave the home. But shockingly, the family court mandated the children to visit with the father while he was on a temporary restraining order, so that the restraining order worked against the mother instead. She couldn't get to the children while they were crying and while they were being abused because she couldn't go near the father. So she dropped the temporary restraining order. Then, because the children were, they became suicidal, wrote notes asking to stop dad, or else they would rather die. They've often said that. But they left a suicide note, and the mother, in order to console the children, took them to a nearby hotel to access a pool because they like swimming. It was less than a half hour away. And the father, in malicious prosecution, had the police raid them and take the children away based on charges of absconding with the children, even though there was no evidence for it. But the guardian ad litem at the time acted less like a guardian ad litem, but more like the father's hired hand. She supported his account. The charges were dropped, of course, because there was no evidence. But the judge never returned the children. The father was allowed to keep the children, and now for over 15 months, the mother has not seen or heard from the children, even for 1 minute.
Is not allowed to visit?
Not allowed to visit.
Or to have calls or anything like that. And he's
no calls,
access.
Nothing at all. And the court is trying to state that the mother is mentally ill. So we actually having psychiatrists in the household. She has undergone 7 psychiatric evaluations by world-renowned psychiatrists or doctorate psychologists, and none of this counts in court because they want her to see an anonymous psychiatrist to whom she is to be escorted by chaperone so that she could never find out the identity or the credentials of the psychiatrist. I know this sounds like a spy movie, science fiction, but this apparently is often what happens. It's almost a playbook where those who allege abuse are said to be mentally ill, and those who are actually abusive and violent are considered normal and fit to have the children. That is why a vast majority of children, abused children, go to their abusers. In fact, there was a National Institute of Justice study that was done that showed that if all contested custody cases were overturned, they would be more correct. That's quite a statement, I believe.
Right. So at this point, even if the children had some sort of choice, they have been so socialized into this abusive relationship with their father, they may not even want to leave. Is that correct? Or
well, if that were not, no, children are often reporting abuse, and they are often quite clear-minded. Even reports from 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 6-year-olds are later corroborated to be correct. And yet, children are considered untrustworthy and coached by the parent who's trying to protect them, and they are sent to re-education camps. There are places, Family Bridges is a famous one reported on by the Washington Post, but there's almost a cottage industry of non-mental health professionals or poorly qualified ones who set up these reunification therapies, which are meant to force the children to accept the abuse and to stay with their abusers.
Wow.
And the reason this is happening, and it doesn't happen in Europe, is because the amount of monetary profit that comes from having the children is simply off the scale. In other words, child support is almost unlimited in what you can demand. So if you have the children, you can demand child support of the other spouse. And currently, my sister's husband is demanding 4 times as much as he has ever given her per year when she was running the entire household and raising the children. He's demanding that amount in child support per year when she has been a stay-at-home devoted mom for the last decade.
Wow. And so they're not, what legal stage are they at now? They're not divorced, but what stage are they are at in terms of that?
Well, the litigation has been going on for over 2 years, almost 2.5 years, and they haven't been able to work through the divorce because the child custody issue. And I hear that it has really been the strength of my sister of not backing down that has allowed them not to move forward and just instantly demand all this money from her and put her in jail, or to institutionalize her, or to make her go through a fraudulent psychiatric evaluation so as to be placed under conservatorship. But this is often happens speedily with impunity, because judges have absolute judicial immunity within the courtroom, and unless they actually step outside of the courtroom and shoot someone, that echoes the case, they won't be held accountable. And this is a problem. The absolute immunity and secrecy are pretty much the formula for this kind of abuse of power and corruption, and increasingly organized system of sending children to the wrong parent.
You've gotten incredible positive response to this forthcoming work, correct, Bandy? So it's resonated all over the place, right? Are there attempts to somehow change the family court?
Well, there are many organizations and activists who have been trying for decades to change the family court system. One of the problems has been the public doesn't know about this incredible, some have called it a Holocaust. It is very akin to a Holocaust occurring beneath our awareness, in that families are being destroyed, children's lives are being ruined, and children are being sent to their deaths by the hundreds each year. And yet the public isn't interested, the press isn't interested, because people don't have the information, because family courts have sealed most of their records and penalize anyone who would break that seal. Mothers often have gag orders against them. And with my sister, for example, even her saying that she could not see her children for their second birthday in a row would count as a violation of the court sealing, could land her in jail. So the response has been phenomenal. I thought, when I read that this was an epidemic and that it occurs in all 50 states, that numerous numbers too great to count are being violated in this way, in their legal rights, constitutional rights to due process, and also parental rights. I at first did not believe it, but now that I announced the book, I'm getting an inundation of accounts, stories. Any one of them would be a front page headline story, and yet they're afraid. They are stating they're giving their story anonymously. Those who are out of the case are stating the names of judges and corrupt guardians ad litem very tentatively, because they could be retaliated against. Expert witnesses who gave valid fact-based reports have lost their licenses because either judges or the abusers would relentlessly come after them. So it is really acting like a mafia organization, where there's tremendous amount of violence in the background. I wish to tie this to structural violence, because when this level of rampant corruption and violence is occurring, that points back to structural violence and institutional violence. It's more than just a few rogue judges. In fact, family court judges, the ones I have learned about, any number of them would make the Pennsylvania Kids for Cash judges look like benevolent benefactors. What's happening?
Spend just a couple minutes on that specific case for our audience, the Pennsylvania Kids for Cash case. I just want to make one question on this. When you said the children are led to their death, you're talking about suicide? Is that what you're referring to?
Yes. 1/5 of child murders per
homicide.
year. 1/5 of child murders by parent are from family court. Those we know about are family court induced. They run in since about 1,800 children die from child abuse per year. That's a large number, in the hundreds. And there are many hundreds of suicides per 100 homicide by parent. And there are about 100-fold more in children who are injured and tortured as a result of child abuse.
And this is at the hands of the abusive parent.
Yes.
Now, again, empirically, the evidence is mounting. Isn't there some way that legislators can begin to have hearings on this, and
yes,
as well as, of course, what you're writing as well.
Many attempts have been made, and once a resolution passed successfully in the House to place child safety first in family court custody decisions, because custody decisions seem to be made by any factor other than child abuse, when this should be the primary factor. In fact, I would even argue that perhaps child abuse allegation cases need to be taken out of family court, because even with well-trained mental health professionals, it's often difficult to, especially with sexual abuse, which is 1 in 4 children in the United States. 1 in 4 children are sexually abused, and sexual abusers are often upstanding citizens in societies. They are well behaved. They behave well in front of others in order to better hide their abuse. And yet sexual abuse is often devastating to a child's life.
So are you saying that the family court system is beyond repair and reform? You want to somehow move it to another entity, or what do you?
As long as family courts are resistant to reform, as so far, reform efforts have been unproductive because of the sheer magnitude of the problem, and because of the problem being met with defense and denial, and sometimes outright corrupt interests. And there needs to be some kind of meaningful judicial oversight. And until that happens, this kind of lack of transparency and judicial immunity, which in many cases would be justified, but in family courts it is in fact lethal. We have to allow for more simple transparency of the corruption and criminality and fraud that is going on in what are supposed to be courts of law.
But again, what that judicial oversight would be, how would that come about? I'm hearing what you're saying here. It certainly seems to be necessary, but How would that
I
be
think
set
if
up? How do you envision that happening?
I think if the family courts were not allowed to blanket seal their cases, I've never heard of courts that are allowed to blanket seal their cases in a democracy where the judicial system is public by design in order for this kind of abuse not to occur. Family courts are unique in that initially it was well intended, again, to hide explicit details of sexual abuse done to children, because if the children were identified and associated with these acts, it could affect their lifetime and their career. But nowadays, court seals are able to, judges are placing court seals without any reason stated. In my sister's case, there was no reason stated. They were the ones who said that the father was not abusing the children, so why would they even need a seal? And yet they have placed a seal, a gag order against my sister. The father can say anything he wishes, or even make up court orders and frighten neighbors and other parents into compliance. But the mother, she can't even state plain facts, let alone what's going on in the court system. So, and there's a doctrine, a Rooker-Feldman doctrine, that prevents family cases from going to federal court, even though due process violations, human rights violations, and parental rights violations are rampant in family court. In fact, it's deprivation of legal rights to the unfavored party.
So, as you say, this is a worldwide issue. So, perhaps again, World Health Organizations and United Nations needs to take this up as well. You mentioned structural violence and the lack of transparency in the family courts. Can you talk a little about the psychosocial dynamics that are involved here, which, in a sense, is helping to produce the domestic violence that is leading to even more suffering? How is that going on?
Yes, as we know, those who are abusive personalities, in fact, especially violent personalities, are extremely good at covering up their violence. In fact, the more violent they are, the better they often are at putting on a disguise, conning others, or beguiling others. This is one talent that they have to compensate for the extreme lack of skills in other interpersonal.
And social conscience.
Yes, they lack a conscience.
Yeah.
And in fact, they often escape prosecution in criminal courts as well. Those, one of the great frustrations for us forensic psychiatrists is often to find even seasoned prosecutors and judges let go of the most heinous offenders because they're able to fool them so effectively. And so, in fact, the most extreme form is psychopathy, so psychopathic personality disorder, or psychopathy, which, and studies have shown that those with psychopathy get out of jail, receive lesser prison sentences, and are often not caught with multifold frequency. In other words, they're multifold less likely to be caught, to be sentenced, or to be kept in jail than non-psychopathic individuals who committed the same crime. And so what family courts need to recognize is that there are these extremely dangerous individuals who are using family courts as their weapon against those who they're trying to torment, as a way to seize and warehouse children so that they can earn money through it, through child support and not paying alimony, to incarcerate and punish their victims who are trying to get away. And family courts not only have traditionally not recognized these individuals as gathering around the family courts to use the courts to this end. And sometimes I hear that the family courts tampering with evidence can also exonerate them from criminal cases. So it's a way to also escape criminal prosecution.
Yeah, that's an extremely important point. I think you just illustrated there. So the child abuse obviously cuts across class and racial and ethnic lines, but you seem to be talking about the influence of money here and power and those.
Yes.
So how is this tied into structural violence?
So family court corruption is actually worst in the affluent communities. And there are family court expert witnesses who have said they are more likely to be heard in indigent inner city courts than in family courts in affluent areas that see a lot of potential for profit. And so this brings us back to the structural violence that is driving the institutional violence and behavioral violence. Structural violence is the greatest predictor of all forms of violence, including behavioral violence. And as inequality rises in society, and if we map the course of family court corruption, which has exponentially increased since the early 1980s, it matches the map of growing inequality in this country. And we will see how the family court is only the epicenter of judicial corruption. And judicial corruption is only one example of the growing institutional corruption that could be said to be nearly universal and happens even within politics. And the reason this happens is when there is growing structural violence. That is, structural violence can be violence, the discrimination against women, against children, against, it could be in the form of racism, but the current exponentially growing, and it also worsens the other forms of structural violence. The growing form of violence currently is income and wealth inequality. And with this exponentially increasing gap between the rich and the poor, we will see greater structural violence in other areas, in all areas globally. And we will see greater judicial corruption. In fact, I mentioned psychopathy earlier. Individuals with psychopathy are particularly drawn to the legal profession. So they're often judges or lawyers. I believe number one is CEOs of corporations. Right. Secondly, it's the legal system. And thirdly, it's the medical profession. But I believe that number is rapidly going down because the medical profession is not so powerful anymore.
Yeah. Well, who was it that said first, let's get the lawyers? This has been just an eye-opening discussion, Bandy. And we only have about a minute to go, minute or two. So you touched on the growing economic inequalities that lead to all kinds of other consequences and so on. That gives us perhaps some hope in understanding how to prevent this.
Absolutely.
Okay,
yes.
So let's try and leave our audience here with some hope in this incredible story that you're documenting here. So
yes,
it gives
Thank
us.
Thank you for your focus on the structural, sociological, and societal aspects. That is very important, as you know, as myself having been involved in the public health approaches to violence prevention.
Absolutely.
This is a form of violence. It's an issue that truly is not only overdue, but it should become one of the central matters of concern for a democratic society. But my book hopefully will try to expose the problem. It will begin with anecdotes of especially of children who have lived through this experience, and they are the ones who could have become, and many do become, the next generation of murderers and rapists and angry, violent offenders.
Absolutely.
The second
Bandy, go ahead. We 30 seconds.
The second portion will be about the family courts themselves and how this is an epidemic problem, not only all across the country, but now increasingly around the world. First starting with English-speaking countries, but increasingly all countries. And thirdly, I will write about the structural contributions to this. And the hopeful message is that structural violence is such that because it's happening at the structural level, minuscule changes at the top, which hardly cost anything, can downstream effectuate prevention of millions of deaths.
And stop these cycles of violence.
And even to the strengthening of our democracy.
Absolutely. Bandy, thank you so very, very much. Give your sister our love and respect, and thank you so very, very much for being on the show here today, and just illustrating something that so many people aren't aware of, but now are going to be more aware of. So thank you again very much.
Thanks for your thoughts on my sister. She has many prominent people in medicine and the law supporting her. So
wonderful.
We believe things will turn out okay.
I hope so, and I believe it would. It will, and it should. So thank you again, Bandy, and thank you all very, very much for watching us this week on The Radical Imagination. This is Jim Freddos. We'll see you again next week on The Radical Imagination.